All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and begin. I'm Matt Holland. I'm the program and volunteer coordinator at the Buffalo History Museum. Welcome to I Do Solemnly Swear Presidential Inauguration History and Traditions with Courtney Speckmann. This is a program that's put on by both the Theodore, Roosevelt Inaugural Site, Buffalo Presidential Center, and the History Museum. And our speaker tonight is Courtney Speckmann. She's worked at the White House Historical Association in Washington, D.C., where she served as the Director of Education, holds a master's degree in museum education from the George Washington University, and a bachelor's degree from Susquehanna University in history. And just a few details about the program layout. We'll have a Q&A at the end, so please hold your questions until the end. I'll try to keep track of questions if there are any along the way. And we'll try to give a little bit of time for that. If we might have to pick and choose questions if there's not enough time. So just a little warning on that. And then also for those of you, if you're having technical difficulties, or if you know somebody who couldn't make it, or etc., we'll be posting this on the museum's YouTube page, so you can watch it later, and I'll contact everybody via email with a link for that. So that'll be usually two or three business days. So anyways, I'll hand it over to Courtney.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's nice to be here with everybody tonight. I thought that I would talk a little bit first about the Buffalo Presidential Center, and then get right into the program. So as Matt said, I've been working with the Buffalo Presidential Center as a member of the Board of Trustees. The Buffalo Presidential Center is an all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit organization chartered by the state of New York to explore and share stories about Buffalo and Western New York's historic and contemporary contributions to the U.S. presidency and to national affairs. Buffalo has one of the richest presidential histories of any city outside of Washington, D.C. So we're really thrilled to be here tonight with the TR Inaugural Site, which I will talk about a little bit tonight, and the Buffalo History Museum, both of who have lots of really great artifacts and presidential objects in their collections. For more than 10 years, the Buffalo Presidential Center has presented a variety of public programs and exhibitions to audiences throughout Western New York, and we were really proud of what you see on the screen right now is our new permanent 1,700 square foot museum space that will house permanent and temporary exhibitions. We have storage space, and we are excited to be in the Buffalo and Erie County Library System. We are looking forward to officially opening sometime in 2021. So we look forward to welcoming you soon to the Central Library in downtown. We are in the midst of a capital campaign. If you are interested in donating and supporting to us, all donations of $100 or more received by the end of the month will have an opportunity to be recognized on our founding supporters wall in the new museum. So that is my pitch as a board member. But for tonight, we're talking about presidential inauguration history and traditions. So every 4 years, our country inaugurates the president and the vice president of the United States. Although the Constitution provides an oath for each new president to take, all other elements of the traditional inauguration have grown from changes, different traditions and preferences that have evolved quite a bit. While there are many traditions, not all of them look the same for each inauguration. So there are some similarities and some differences each time. What is perhaps the most significant is that inaugurations represent a peaceful transfer of power from one administration to the next. So I chose to start with this image today on the screen, not only because it shows George Washington's first inauguration in 1789, but also because this mural is located inside the US Capitol building. There's an artist named Alan Cox who began the designs for all three corridors of the House wing of the Capitol in 1973, which are now known as the Cox Corridors. The corridor that includes this mural is referred to as the Great Experiment Hall because it highlights 16 scenes in our country's history, from the signing of the Mayflower Compact in 1629 to the enactment of women's suffrage in 1920. George Washington was sworn in as the nation's first president on April 30th, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. And this mural depicts from left to right, you have Robert Livingston, the Chancellor of the State of New York, who is administering the oath, Secretary of the Senate, Samuel Otis, who is holding the Bible, George Washington with his hand raised, and Vice President John Adams to his right. The US Constitution did not provide much direction on what the inauguration should look like, but it did provide this instruction on the oath of office, which is found in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 8. So the oath that we all know, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Everything else that happened at George Washington's inauguration happened, I will talk about in a little bit, but this is what is in the Constitution. The 12th Amendment changed the way the president and vice president were chosen under Article 2. Originally, the Electoral College voted for two people on the same ballot without distinguishing between offices. The person who received the most electoral votes became president. The person who came in second became vice president. But the creation of the political parties and a tie in the Electoral College prompted the adoption of the 12th Amendment in 1804 to create separate balloting for the president and the vice president. What's interesting about the 12th Amendment is that it is the first time that a date, the 4th day of March, is added to the Constitution as the inauguration date. Congress had set March 4th as the inauguration date prior to this amendment, but this is where it is actually written into the Constitution. I will mention only twice in American history has the House of Representatives chosen the president, first for Thomas Jefferson in 1800, which is what prompted the addition of the 12th Amendment, and then John Quincy Adams in 1824. And then we come to the 20th Amendment. Ratified on January 23rd, 1933, it sets the terms of the president and the vice president to end at noon on January 20th. So we've moved from March 4th to January 20th. Congress originally set March 4th as the inauguration date before the 12th Amendment made it official. This made sense at the time because it took a while to confirm election results, and newly elected presidents and members of Congress had to travel great distances by horse and carriage. As the nation became more industrialized, the 4 months in between Election Day and Inauguration Day were increasingly problematic. This was especially true in the period between Franklin D. Roosevelt's election and his first inauguration, as the Depression worsened and the banking system collapsed. This period is sometimes known as a lame duck period, or a transition period. The 20th Amendment was proposed by Congress on March 2nd, 1932, and it was quickly ratified, but it would not take effect until October. So it didn't apply until FDR's second inauguration. As a result, FDR was the last president to take the oath on March 4th in 1933, and he was the first president to take the oath of office on January 20th in 1937. So here we have official inaugural programs. The one on the left, I found it at the FDR Presidential Library. The one on the right, I found at the Library of Congress. They look identical except for the dates. You can see his first inauguration on the left is March 4th, 1933. The one on the right is January 20th, 1937. James Monroe, his second inauguration, was the first to fall on a Sunday. Monroe decided to hold the inaugural ceremony on Monday, March 5th, after consulting with Supreme Court justices. You can see Zachary Taylor followed suit, and he also postponed the oath of office by 1 day so that it would not be on Sunday. Rutherford B. Hayes privately took the oath of office early on Saturday, March 3rd, in the White House Red Room to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. The public inauguration was on Monday, March 5th, and he was the first president to take the oath at the White House. Woodrow Wilson in 1917 was the first president to take the oath of office on a Sunday. He was sworn in privately in the president's room at the US Capitol by the Chief Justice, and he held his public inauguration ceremony the following day. And that has been more or less how the succeeding presidents have handled the inauguration when it falls on a Sunday. They take the oath privately. Usually it's been at the White House, a private ceremony on Sunday, and the public ceremony would be the next day on Monday. That takes us to this tale of 4 oaths. President Obama, he did take the oath of office 4 times. So we can see the 4 pictures here. The 2 pictures on the left are from 2009. The pictures on the right are from 2013. In 2013, his inauguration fell on a Sunday. So the president took the oath privately in the Blue Room with his family. And then he had his traditional ceremony the following day, which is the bottom right-hand corner or bottom right-hand photo. And in 2009, Chief Justice John Roberts incorrectly recited part of the oath. Roberts prompted that I will execute the office of president to the United States faithfully. And when President Obama tried to stop and wait for Roberts to correct himself, after a false start, still continued with saying, execute faithfully. So it didn't seem like a really big departure, but it was not word for word in the oath. So the oath was re-administered the next day by Chief Justice Roberts in the map room at the White House, which is what you see in the bottom left-hand corner. And he did, I know that there were some staff members in the Obama White House that wrote that this felt like their first constitutional crisis within the first 24 hours of the administration. So they wanted to make sure that it was right and that there was no claims that his presidency was in any way illegitimate. So they made sure that he did say the oath word for word. On a short side note, I also wanted to mention that Chief Justice John Roberts is a Buffalonian. He was born in Buffalo. He lived here until he was about 10 years old. And there is a small area in the Buffalo Presidential Center's museum that highlights him and his career. There have been other similar mishaps with the oath of office. President Obama was definitely not the only one. In fact, President William Howard Taft, we can see here as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is on the left-hand side. So it's on the left, and then on the right is President Herbert Hoover. When William Howard Taft became the Chief Justice, he recalled misquoting the oath when he was administering the oath to President Hoover, using the words preserve, maintain, and defend the Constitution instead of preserve, protect, and defend. He recalled a similar incident happening when he himself was being sworn in as the president. Taft wrote, when I was sworn in as president by Chief Justice Fuller, he made a similar slip and added, but in the days when there was no radio, it was observed only in the Senate chamber where I took the oath. He didn't have quite as big of an audience to witness him misspeak the oath as well, but it has happened before. In both of his inaugurations, President Dwight Eisenhower said the office of the President of the United States instead of the office of President of the United States. In 1965, Chief Justice Earl Warren prompted Lyndon Johnson to say the office of the Presidency of the United States accidentally. And President Richard Nixon added an extra and in preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. These all seem like pretty minor errors overall, but since it is the only part of the inauguration that is spelled out in the Constitution, it gives the oath a little bit more scrutiny than some of the other traditions and ceremonial aspects of the day. It's definitely that is the highlight of the inauguration. Including the inauguration of Joe Biden last week, the oath has now been taken 73 different times by 45 presidents. If you remember, Grover Cleveland has 2 numbers. He has non-consecutive terms. He is our 22nd and 24th president. A president must take the oath at the beginning of each term of office And as I mentioned, some presidents have taken the oath of office more than once. George Washington's inauguration did set many precedents, which we will discuss shortly. However, the location was not one of them. His second inauguration took place in Philadelphia, which had become the temporary capital of the United States from 1790 to 1800. George Washington signed the Residence Act in 1790 to create a permanent national capital in Washington, D.C. The oath of office has been administered at the U.S. Capitol more times than any other place. It was 56 out of 73 times. Thomas Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated there in 1801. He took the oath of office inside the Senate chamber. The US Capitol was later burned by the British in 1814 during the War of 1812. So James Monroe held his first inauguration in 1817 on a platform in front of the temporary brick Capitol, which is the site of our Supreme Court building. Andrew Jackson was the first president to take the oath of office on the east portico outside of the Capitol, which became the preferred location for a little over 150 years. You can see his picture on the top. This is another one of the murals that was drawn by Alan Cox in the Capitol. So this is one of the other scenes that you can see close to George Washington's first inauguration. We also see on the left an aerial view of the Capitol at Franklin Roosevelt's first inauguration that shows the crowds of people below, and you can see the east front with the pediment. You can see the triangular pediment, which is how you know that you're looking at the east portico of the Capitol. On the bottom in the middle is a scene from William McKinley's inauguration. And on the right, we have a photograph showing Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration. So up until Ronald Reagan, this is where the majority of our inaugurations have taken place. However, in 1981, Ronald Reagan decided, or he was the first president to move the inaugural ceremony from the east portico of the Capitol to the west front. Here you can see the view on the left-hand side to the National Mall, the Washington Monument, and it provided a little bit more space for spectators and a little bit more room for them to expand down the mall. The Joint Congressional Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies, which is the group responsible for planning inaugurations, decided to move the location in part to save money, since the west front terrace could be used as an inaugural platform, so they wouldn't have to build one necessarily from scratch. Also, since the west front faced the mall, it was a little bit easier for them to expand as the ceremony grew. So far, 9 inaugurations have been held on the west front of the Capitol over the last 40 years. Ronald Reagan began the current tradition of holding the inauguration on the west front, but his second inauguration was not held there because it was too cold. His first inauguration holds the record for being the warmest ever at 55 degrees. However, his second inauguration, interestingly enough, holds the record for being the coldest inauguration at 7 degrees. In 1885, his second inauguration also fell on a Sunday. So he was sworn in privately, and as it also happened to be Super Bowl Sunday, I believe it was the only time that January 20th fell on Super Bowl Sunday, he also did a satellite call to the Super Bowl where he participated in a virtual coin toss. So that was his second inauguration day. His public inauguration was on January 21st, the following day on Monday, but it took place inside the Capitol Rotunda because of the freezing temperature, the freezing weather outside. So moving a little bit too fast. On the right, FDR's fourth inauguration took place at the White House. Other presidents have taken the oath of office there. As I mentioned, President Hayes is the first, but President Roosevelt is one of the early ones to have his actual ceremony held at the White House on January 20th. At this point, this was his fourth inauguration. It was in the midst of World War II. There was rationing. They canceled the parade because of gas rationing and lumber shortages. And FDR did not want to make a big scene about his inauguration at this point. He didn't want a large ceremony, and he wanted to keep it as simple as possible. It's also possible that his declining health may have played a role in staying closer at the White House as well. He would die, he passed away about 80, I think it was 89 days later after his inauguration. So there have been other locations in DC, but as I mentioned, the Capitol has been the tradition. The oath has also been administered outside of Washington, D.C. a total of 7 times. The first 3 were by George Washington and John Adams before Washington had become the permanent capital, and had been created as the capital. And in the other 4 instances, the oath was administered outside of Washington, D.C. due to the death or assassination of a president. The first was Chester Arthur in 1881. James Garfield was shot at a railroad station in Washington, D.C. on July 2nd, 1881, and he died on September 19th. The oath of office was administered to Chester Arthur, his vice president, at his home in New York City the following day. He took the oath. It was administered by Justice John R. Brady of the New York State Supreme Court. And when he returned to Washington, D.C., he repeated the oath of office at the U.S. Capitol 2 days later. Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901 following the assassination of William McKinley. This is something that I know at the TR Inaugural site knows a lot about. McKinley was shot in Buffalo, New York on September 6th, 1901, and died on September 14th. Roosevelt had been camping in the Adirondacks when he learned that McKinley was not expected to survive. Roosevelt was rushed to a train station, and upon arriving in Buffalo, learned that the president had passed away. He didn't have any real formal instruction on how to proceed, but he accepted an invitation to stay at this home that we can see on the left-hand side. Belonged to Ainsley Wilcox, and this is where his inauguration took place. The federal judge, John R. Hazel, administered the oath before a large party of dignitaries and witnesses, and the Wilcox home is now the site of the TR Inaugural site, which also happens to be the only National Park Service location in Western New York. They have a lot of really great resources on their website, including a 360-degree virtual tour. And I highly recommend that you check out their resources and visit. On the top right-hand picture, we see Calvin Coolidge taking the oath of office. He was in Vermont when he learned about the death of Warren Harding. It was a sudden death while he was on a speaking tour in the Western states. Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as president at his parents' home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, and the oath was actually administered by his father, who was a notary public and a justice of the peace. He took the oath of office again in Washington, D.C. at the Willard Hotel, as there was some conversation about how a state official should not swear in a federal official. So there was some question about whether that would stand and be legal. So he quietly took the oath of office again at the Willard so that there would be no question about the legitimacy of his oath. And of course, on the bottom right-hand side, we have Lyndon Johnson standing next to Jacqueline Kennedy, and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, is on the other side in Dallas, Texas, on Air Force One after President John F. Kennedy's death in 1963. Lyndon Johnson actually took the oath on board Air Force One while they were still in Dallas. And in addition to being the only president to assume office in an airplane, it is also the first time that a woman, U.S. District Judge Sarah Hughes, administered the oath of office. So we've talked about kind of the location of where the oath has taken place and some of the traditions and customs surrounding that. But we're going to go back to the first inauguration now with George Washington's inauguration at Federal Hall in New York City on April 30th, 1789, which is not one of the dates that we've talked about so far. As I mentioned before, Congress set the date of March 4th, but George Washington was not inaugurated until April 30th because they were unable to count the electoral votes as early as they had anticipated, and George Washington needed the time to travel to New York City from his home in Mount Vernon in Virginia. George Washington was in kind of a tough spot in a way because everything he did would be scrutinized and examined and set a precedent for everybody else. Mount Vernon has an interactive timeline on their website that details everything that happened on the day of his inauguration that I highly recommend if you're interested in learning more about our first inauguration. But I'll share a few of the details of his inauguration. He rode to the inauguration via a coach in a ceremonial procession that included a military contingent of 500 men, including a troop of horse, artillery, 2 companies of grenadiers, a company of light infantry, and a company of Scottish Highlanders in traditional garb. He was greeted by his vice president, John Adams, at Federal Hall. The oath was administered, as I said before, by Chancellor of the State of New York, Robert Livingston. It took place on the balcony outside the Senate chamber so that the greatest number of the people of the United States could witness the event. Samuel Otis, Secretary of the Senate, held the ceremonial Bible, which was a Masonic Bible acquired at the last minute from St. John's Lodge. I always think that somebody is scrambling to find a Bible at the last moment. After taking the oath of office, Washington kissed the Bible, and Robert Livingston turned to the crowd below and shouted, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." George Washington bowed to the crowd, and then he left the balcony to deliver his inaugural address inside the Senate chamber. The address was not given to the public, it was given inside. In the afternoon, he attended a church service at St. Paul's Chapel in New York and was then escorted to the presidential mansion at Franklin House, where he dined alone. Washington later joined the inaugural party to watch fireworks and illuminations in his honor. He got in his carriage to return home, but there were so many people out in the streets that he was forced to abandon the carriage and walk the rest of the way. Due to pressing public business, the inaugural ball, there was an inaugural ball, but it was postponed for 1 week to May 7th, and his wife, Martha, did not make the trip to New York. The advent of technology and changes in our country have impacted the various elements of ceremonies and the way that we, the American people, interact, engage, and witness to remember them. In this picture, well, I should say, before we get to James K. Polk, I will say William Henry Harrison in 1841 was the first president to arrive in DC by train. So we'll go through a few different advances in technology and envision how that would have changed the way that the inaugurations were held. James K. Polk here, his inauguration in 1845 was the first inauguration covered by telegraph, and it was also the first known newspaper illustration of a presidential inauguration. So this image that we see here is from the Library of Congress. It was published in the Illustrated London News. So this is one of the earliest illustrations that we have from that time period, a contemporary illustration. 12 years later, James Buchanan in 1857, he was the first to be photographed. His inauguration was the first to be photographed. So you can see how things have changed quickly, even in 12 years. We've gone from illustrations to photographs. William McKinley in 1897, his was the first inauguration to be filmed with sound recording or a motion picture camera. And in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt's second inauguration was the first to have telephones installed on the Capitol grounds for an inauguration. Warren Harding in 1921 was the first inauguration to be amplified with loudspeakers. So I always think that we see all of these pictures before Harding's with lots of crowds, but there's no amplification, no speakers. So it would have been difficult to hear depending on where you were. Warren Harding was also the first president to ride to and from his inauguration in an automobile. Calvin Coolidge in 1825 was the first, his was the first inauguration to be broadcast on radio. Herbert Hoover in 1929 was the first inaugural ceremony to be recorded by a talking newsreel. So we're still advancing quite a bit. And then we get to Harry Truman's inauguration in 1949 is the first to be televised. And if you can see in the picture, the platform, we're still on the east front of the Capitol. The platform on the left-hand side is where the president is, and that's where the president is facing the crowd. You can see the crowd. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that a new platform has been erected specifically for the television cameras. So pointing right at the inauguration. Ronald Reagan in 1981 was the first, his was the first closed captioning of television broadcast for the hearing impaired. In 1985, a television camera was placed inside the president's limousine for the first time to capture the journey from the Capitol to the White House. And of course, in 1997, during Bill Clinton's inauguration, was the first to be streamed on the internet. So 1997 was the first on the internet. So obviously, there are lots of traditions. George Washington did set many precedents, but there have been many traditions that have evolved as we change the way that we engage with inaugurations and get to witness them. So what usually happens on Inauguration Day, and I'm trying to be as clear as I am that there's no set schedule. There's no set thing that has to happen on Inauguration Day. The Constitution only states that the oath of office has to be given. So what usually, that is in italics, what usually happens, this is the precedent that has been set in more recent years. The president will attend a church service, mostly. George Washington, we know he did attend a church service in the afternoon after taking the oath of office. FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, who are pictured on the right, they attended St. John's Church for a morning worship service before his first inauguration, which began a new tradition. St. John's Church, as you can see in the picture on the left, is located directly across Lafayette Square from the White House. And it is known as the Church of the Presidents because every president since James Madison has attended services there at some point during their presidency. Not all on Inauguration Day, not every president has attended there on Inauguration Day, but has attended services at some point, essentially since it was built. We know that President Biden just last week attended a church service at the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle on the morning of his inauguration. So we know that this tradition is still going forward. Traditionally, the incoming family has been invited to the White House in the morning for a pre-inaugural tea or coffee reception at the White House. And then they would ride together from the White House to the US Capitol. This does not happen all the time. The first time a president and president-elect rode together to the Capitol was in 1837 for the inauguration of Martin Van Buren. This is when he rode with outgoing President Andrew Jackson. He was Andrew Jackson's vice president, so they did have, you would assume, a good relationship at that point. I know you're thinking that this tradition is not one that happened this year. And honestly, even if the Trump family had decided to attend President Biden's inauguration, doesn't necessarily mean that this reception would have taken place anyway, because there were so many extra precautions in place that I'll talk about today to avoid close contact because of the pandemic. So it's not a guarantee, even if it had been a more typical year, that this would have still happened. There are other presidents who did not attend their successor's inauguration, which first, most famously, it was John Adams, who left DC before Thomas Jefferson's inauguration. John Quincy Adams also did not attend. Neither did Martin Van Buren or Andrew Johnson. So I know of at least those four that did not attend the inauguration of their successor. So from the Capitol, We have the vice president and the president is sworn in. And the vice president was not always sworn in at the Capitol, but that has become a more modern tradition. John Adams was the first president to receive the oath of office from the Chief Justice of the United States. Although not specified in the Constitution, the oath of office has been administered by the Chief Justice at every inauguration, except in a few instances following the death of a sitting president. The constitutional language gives the option to either affirm or swear. As you saw, I do swear or affirm. So far, Franklin Pierce has been the only president known to use the word affirm instead of swear. Most presidents have used family Bibles. As we said, George Washington found a Bible kind of at the last minute from a Masonic lodge. And most presidents have used family Bibles for the oath of office, although some have used Bibles of historic significance, such as the Lincoln Bible, which is pictured at the top here. This Bible was used by Abraham Lincoln at his inauguration, and both Barack Obama and Donald Trump used it for their inaugurations as well, which is currently in the collection, well, it is in the collection of the Library of Congress. Some presidents have used two Bibles to swear the oath of office. We know that when I was reading through what happened at George Washington's inauguration, he did kiss the Bible at the end of his oath, and that tradition did continue through Harry Truman's inauguration, with the exception of Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce did not kiss the Bible, but he merely placed his left hand on it, which is now the current custom. Dwight Eisenhower was really the first to break the tradition. He opted to say a prayer instead of kiss the Bible. We know that we see here in these pictures, the first ladies have been holding the Bible. We saw that last week with Dr. Biden. And it was Lady Bird Johnson who was the first lady to hold the Bible for her husband at the inauguration. Not all presidents have used a Bible. John Quincy Adams actually took the oath upon a volume of law in the Constitution, according to his own version of the inauguration. And no Bible was actually used here in Buffalo at Theodore Roosevelt's first inauguration. The story that I had heard is that Mr. Ainsley Wilcox wrote that according to his best recollection, no Bible was used, but President Roosevelt was sworn in with uplifted hand. There was one story, I think, from the TR site that said the Bible, they might not have been able to find the Bible, but I will have to go to their expertise on that. The oath does have to be taken at or before noon. All the powers transfer to him at the end of the 12 o'clock minutes, at 12:01. We would not have two presidents at any given time. I know last week you may have seen President Biden took his oath of office a little bit before 12. I heard there were some questions about whether or not he did it too early. What they need to do is have the oath done by 12 so that the powers can transfer seamlessly without having a gap. So the oath of office has to be administered at or usually just before noon. The next aspect after the oath of office is the inaugural address. This is really the first opportunity for the new president to speak to the nation. The inaugural addresses have varied in length. The shortest one is George Washington. His second inaugural address was only 135 words. I guarantee you I am speaking longer than that tonight. The longest was William Henry Harrison at 8,445 words. I don't think I'm not going that long tonight. So I'm right in the middle. So we have had a variety in talks and addresses, just depending on the moment and the person giving the talk. Franklin Pierce, I know I mentioned him already, he is the first and possibly the only president to be able to recite his entire speech from memory, which is pretty impressive. Most presidents use their inaugural address to present their vision of America and their goals for the nation. There are many famous and memorable lines that we can discuss that come from inaugural addresses that sometimes stand out because of how they met the moment that they were in and inspired or unified the country at the time. I think of Thomas Jefferson in 1800 after a really contested election, as he said the House of Representatives actually chose him, where he said in 1800, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. We are neither Republicans or Federalists, we are Americans. This transition of power has not been effected indeed by the sword, but by the rational and peaceable instrument of reform, the suffrage of the people." I think that's really interesting because this is the first time that power transitioned between two different political parties. So this was a way for him to try to unify the nation that had been so bitterly divided. We also think of FDR's "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," who spoke directly to the nation's concerns about the Great Depression. So it's spoken and was part of that moment. We have John F. Kennedy on the left. "Ask not what you can do for your country, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Another way to try to unify the nation. The top right, we have William McKinley giving his inaugural address, which I really enjoy. Grover Cleveland looming right over him, the outgoing president. And then on the bottom right, we have Woodrow Wilson giving his talk. And while the ceremony is going on, we also have a lot of activity happening at the White House itself. After the inaugural ceremony, the new president will escort the former president out of the US Capitol. And I'll mention Gerald Ford, as outgoing president at Jimmy Carter's inauguration, was the first to leave the Capitol grounds by helicopter. But that has become kind of a more modern tradition for a helicopter to take the outgoing president away from the Capitol. At this point, the outgoing president and the first family will have already said goodbye to the White House resident staff that they spend so much time with during their years at the White House. While the inaugural ceremonies are being held, there is a big push to move the former first family out and move the new first family's belongings in. This is an amazing amount of work that happens in a day. There is quotes from staff that say by the time the new family is moving into the White House at the end of the inauguration ceremony, their pictures are hanging on the wall, their favorite foods are in the fridge. Everything is happening so that when the new family comes into the White House, it is their home. Their furniture is there, everything is unpacked. The tradition was also started, I believe, in the 1980s, where the outgoing president leaves a note of encouragement for the incoming president. And this is a tradition that carried through to this year as well. I heard on the bottom left-hand corner, we have the Oval Office and the Resolute desk, where George W. Bush left a letter for Barack Obama. And on the Post-it note, I know you probably can't see that, but he wrote 44, which was President Obama's presidential number. The letters that outgoing presidents write to their successors kind of serve as a reminder of the sanctity of the office, that the presidency is not about a particular person, it's about our country and about the American democracy, and evidence that the president is part of something that is larger than themselves. After taking the oath of office at the Capitol, it became a tradition for the president, the congressmen, and the public to travel by foot or horse or carriage to the White House. When Andrew Jackson took office in 1829, a mob forced their way into the White House looking for food and drink. They stood on furniture with muddy boots and pushed their way through the rooms hoping to congratulate Jackson. China was smashed, and Jackson actually escaped through a window and spent the night at a nearby hotel, with few people even noticing that he had left. The crowd spilled out onto the lawn, and they continued to drink punch from large tubs for the majority of the night. Can't imagine this happening anymore, but I love the title of this drawing was President's Levee, or All Creation Going to the White House. This was definitely on the more rowdy side of an inauguration ceremony in 1829. Presidents and their families will still host receptions at the White House to greet visitors and well-wishers, but it is definitely changed quite a bit since Andrew Jackson's inauguration. So after the former president has left, there is usually a signing ceremony at the Capitol for official nominations and cabinet positions. There's typically, that didn't happen this year, but there's typically an inaugural lunch with members of Congress, and then the first family will make their way to the White House. There is an inaugural parade that is a tradition that really harkens to George Washington's reviewing of the troops and him walking to and from Federal Hall in New York City. In 1805, Jefferson's march involved a collection of people from the Capitol and is considered the first inauguration parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. Martin Van Buren was the first to use floats in an inaugural parade. So he got to ride to the Capitol with Andrew Jackson, and then he had floats in his parade going back to the White House. Franklin Pierce, I read, drove to and from the Capitol standing up in his carriage the whole way. And Abraham Lincoln, at his second inaugural, it was the first time that African Americans participated in the parade itself. Women would be part of the parade for the first time at Wilson's second inaugural. William Howard Taft, his inauguration took place actually inside the Senate chamber because of a blizzard. His is the other inauguration that I think of that had really terrible weather. The strong winds toppled trees and telephone poles, trains that were stalled, and city streets were unpassable. It took 6,000 men and 500 wagons to clear 58,000 tons of snow and slush from the parade route. Helen Taft, his wife, was the first lady to accompany her husband on the return ride from the Capitol to the White House after the inauguration. It was also the first use of an automobile in the parade, although they didn't use the car. They were not in the car, but there was a car that was part of the parade. The picture that you see on the left is Calvin Coolidge actually riding in the automobile. And it was his predecessor, Warren Harding, who was the first to actually ride in an automobile from his inauguration. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson was the first lady to accompany the president both to and from the Capitol at Wilson's second inauguration. And that's when women participated in the parade for the first time as well. The parade would not be televised in color until John F. Kennedy. And Jimmy Carter was the first president to exit his limousine just outside the Capitol grounds and walk along Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House with his family. And we traditionally will see the first family now getting out of the car at some point to walk at least a portion of the parade route. Jimmy Carter did a lot of the parade route. We saw even last week, Joe Biden, Dr. Biden, President Biden, Dr. Biden, did get out of the car on Pennsylvania Avenue, and they walked the last block or so to the front door of the White House. So this is a tradition that carries on. You see the Reagans, the Carters, the Obamas. The top right is Dwight Eisenhower riding in the car. And then I already said Calvin Coolidge on the left. So once they get to the White House, there is time, there's a reviewing stand that is usually constructed for the use of the president to watch the parade come by the White House. Sometimes this has become necessary as the inaugural parades got longer and longer, sometimes lasting for more than 5 hours. The design of these stands has varied greatly over time, with some being just platforms, simple platforms, and others were elaborate two-story structures. On the left-hand side, we have James Garfield's inaugural presidential reviewing stand. He was the first president to review the parade from a stand built in front of the White House. And on the left, or on the right-hand side, you can actually see the White House visible in the background. This is, I believe, William McKinley, who was the first president to have a glass enclosed reviewing stand for the inaugural parade. Today, the reviewing stands are equipped with bulletproof glass, heaters, seats, and refreshments, so they can watch the parade in pretty good comfort. The newly inaugurated president's family, friends, and invited dignitaries can watch the long parade in a more comfortable environment. And here on the top left, we have George H.W. Bush's reviewing stand in front of the White House. The bottom left, you might be able to guess by the peanut parade float, is Jimmy Carter's inauguration. Jimmy Carter was also the first to use solar heating to warm the review stand, which is an interesting fact as well. On the top right, this is Franklin Roosevelt's second inauguration. His reviewing stand was made to resemble Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, so his home in Tennessee. And in the bottom right, you get kind of the opposite perspective of President Obama and his family and the view that they can see from the review stand out to Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. After 6 p.m., well, anytime after, again, this is not, these are just random or kind of general times that does not have to follow a set schedule at all, and everyone is a little bit different, but traditionally in the evening there will be inaugural balls. The first inaugural ball to be held on the day of the inauguration was for James Madison. The U.S. Marine Band also set a precedent at James Madison's inauguration by playing at the inaugural ball, and they have been involved with every inauguration ever since, including this year. Andrew Jackson, his second inauguration was the first time that 2 balls were held on the same evening. Zachary Taylor had 3 inaugural balls, and Abraham Lincoln actually served as the manager of 2 of his balls that year. Franklin Pierce canceled the inaugural ball in 1853, possibly because he was still mourning the death of his son, who had died 2 months before his inauguration. There was not a lot of ceremony in general for Franklin Pierce's inauguration, sadly. And Woodrow Wilson also suspended the inaugural ball for the first time since 1853 because he requested that it be canceled because he found it inappropriate for the solemn occasion. Harry Truman would later reinstate the inaugural ball. John F. Kennedy expanded it to, well, they expanded under John F. Kennedy to 5 inaugural balls, and Ronald Reagan had 9. The balls for Ronald Reagan were transmitted by satellite to 32 different ballroom sites across the country. You can see that it has just grown and grown and grown. And I can't remember, I did not remember to look up how many we had in the succeeding administrations, but I know that it just continues to grow and have many balls. I think we all knew that this year's inauguration would be slightly different because of the pandemic and the additional security measures as a result of the insurrection that took place 3 weeks ago now. Still, I was really impressed to see how many of the traditions they were able to pull through in spite of the pandemic and everything that's happened, even if they were not all done in a traditional way. President Biden still attended the church service. He was still sworn in at the US Capitol, gave his inaugural address. He used the moment to acknowledge the hardships that we are all facing as a country right now. I especially was impressed with the moment of silence that he offered on behalf of the more than 400,000 Americans who have died from COVID. He reviewed the military troops. He participated in a wreath-laying ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in a show of solidarity with the living presidents who were able to join him. And they presented a virtual parade and a virtual evening program. So I think the picture on the right is what is most striking in a different tone of, you would normally see just swarms of people. And they decided they didn't want to have an empty mall. So I really thought that adding the flags was a nice touch for this year. You can see even on the stand how distance they kept everybody. You can see the Marine Band in the bottom picture right in the center. So I thought that they, it was going to be challenging no matter what happened, but it came together pretty well considering all of the traditions that they were able to withhold. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the recognition that Shirley Chisholm has been receiving as a result of having the first woman and the first woman of color to be elected as vice president. There were reports saying that Vice President Harris was dressed in purple to honor her, the 7-term New York representative. Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to the United States Congress, and she ran for president in 1972. Chisholm used the colors purple and yellow in her campaign, which also harkened back to the suffragists earlier. And Harris actually picked up those colors for her own presidential bid. After leaving Congress, Chisholm moved to the Buffalo area and passed away in 2005, and she's buried at Forest Lawn in Buffalo as well. So the Buffalo Presidential Center has a space dedicated to Shirley Chisholm in our museum, and these buttons that you can see here are part of what's on display. So when we are able to open, you'll be able to see kind of an area dedicated to her as well. And I included this, it was a tweet, just a screenshot of a tweet that Vice President Harris sent just before the inauguration that just kind of proved that she was on the minds of many people at this really historic inauguration. I'm going to end with this slide today. On the left, we have a photograph of Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration in 1861. And I kind of been thinking about this inauguration a lot in the last couple of months. In the still 4 months between his election and his inauguration, 7 southern states had seceded from our country, and the Civil War would begin the following month after his inauguration. We were on the tension was very high at the point of his inauguration. You can also see in the kind of above where Abraham Lincoln is, the dome of the Capitol is still under construction. And it symbolized a country not yet finished, but President Lincoln was determined that work would continue during the war. There was a chaplain of the 27th Ohio named John Eaton who met with Lincoln in 1863 and later wrote about their conversation, saying, "The president remarked that there were some people who thought the work on the Capitol ought to stop on account of the war, people who begrudged the expenditure and the detention of the workmen from the army." He went on to say that in his judgment, the finishing of the Capitol would be a symbol to the nation of the preservation of the Union. If people see the Capitol going on, it is a sign we intend the Union shall go on. Lincoln had once referred to the United States and its experiment in representative self-government as the last best hope of Earth. The construction of the dome was to the people of Lincoln's generation a reassuring symbol of that hope. And on the right-hand side, this is a picture taken of the inaugural stands and the platforms being built ahead of Joe Biden's inauguration. But this particular photograph was taken on November 3rd of last year, which you may remember was Election Day. As you can imagine, a lot of work and preparation is involved with planning an inauguration, and it begins before we know who the next president is going to be. Our country is based on the principle of democracy, where we know that we will have an election and an inauguration every 4 years. So I just wanted to leave you with these 2 images as we talk about our tradition, or as we finish our conversation about the traditions of inaugurations. So thank you so much for joining. I am happy to answer questions, and we'll turn things back over to Matt for now.
All right. Let me see here. Let me check the Q&A. Looks like we have one. This is kind of like a presidential law question, but is it law that a re-elected president has to have a second inauguration? If there wasn't a second inauguration for some reason, would the Speaker of the House become president due to order of succession?
It is a requirement that the president has to take the oath of office for every term. So at the beginning of every term, the president does have to take the oath of office. Just as with every other tradition, there are no other stipulations in the Constitution other than it has to happen at noon on January 20th, or happen by June, or at noon on January 20th. I think what really matters more is the tradition kind of lending itself a legitimacy of the presidency. I think all of the traditions really are what puts into the American public's minds that this is a legitimate start of the new term. It's why Abraham Lincoln, he was facing threats on his way to Washington, D.C., actually kind of snuck into Washington in the middle of the night under no fanfare without telling anybody, and received a lot of criticism by people who said that he's acting like he's not really the president. So I think that, I know there was a lot of talk this year about where Joe Biden should take the inauguration, and I think that it's really important for people to see the oath and see these traditions being followed, because it really puts that into our minds that this is a legitimate start of the presidency.
All right. So far, we don't have any other questions. Just opening it up. We'll see if anybody else has anything. Go ahead, put it in the Q&A, but let's wait for just a second. But that was it. We had a great question about vice presidents and the oath of office, but you also you already answered that. So, all right, doesn't look like anything else is coming in, so I think we're good. But yeah, thanks so much, Courtney. This was a great talk, really fascinating, and thanks for coming on.
Of course, I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure to be here tonight.
All right. Well, good night, everyone. Just like I said, I'll post this. It usually takes about 2 to 3 business days. So if you know of somebody that really wanted to see it, it'll be up soon. So, and I'll send out a link to everybody who's registered. So have a good night.